613. I had 613 rules to follow. Can you imagine that? Can you even understand how many that is? And I knew every one of them, and I followed them, mostly. So there I am, sitting across from Jesus. And he looks at me and says, "Nicodemus, it's not about the rules." I'm paraphrasing him, but essentially that's what he's saying. It's not about the rules. Not about the rules. Look at this from my perspective. I'd seen him come in the day before, and he had turned the temple upside down. This is the place, mind you, that I'd spent my life preserving. So you can imagine how much I wanted to have a talk with him in a secluded place at nighttime. How would you feel if someone said to you, someone you respected, they tell you that everything that you'd dedicated your life to had missed the mark completely? You're a fool. That's how you feel. So I said something to him. One rule that seems too good to be true, because it was. Believe he's the Messiah. Believe he's the one that was promised. And he said it, like he just glazed over it like it was some simple thing. And then went on talking about good and evil, and I'm thinking, wait, go back to where you took what was so complicated and made it not complicated. My whole life was in those complications. My religion was in those complications. Making sure to follow the details of the laws. I made sure that every T was crossed. I thought that is what was going to save me. 613 laws. I was wrong. It was love that saved me. For God so loved.
While many Americans today report that they attend church at least occasionally, the number has dropped over the last several years. The number keeps shrinking, and so people were recently asked in an online forum, if you used to go to church and don't anymore, why? Well, the answers were interesting and insightful, I think. First, people said that there are too many judgmental people in the church. Well, yes, that may be true, but there are many, many kind, loving Christians. And there are plenty of not so kind ones too, but that's the way it is with the world. I mean, if you think about that. Number two, they were hurt at church. You know, unfortunately, church hurt is a very real issue that many Christians struggle with and have had to endure. Number three, they said the service is too loud. Well, I'll try to talk softer. I'm just kidding. That isn't going to ever happen. So, but they said many former church members reported they didn't appreciate how loud and showy the services had become these days. Number four, there were too many false teachings. Some churches have turned aside from their original purpose of sharing the gospel and turned to sermons that are more self-help seminars, with the scriptures really only being used occasionally, just kind of sprinkled in maybe every once in a while. Number 5, the church split. Churches split, and they are very incredibly painful moments for those involved, and it does lead to some who just completely walk away from the church altogether. Number 6, they said their schedules are too busy. Well, we do live in a very busy world. People are busier than ever. And this does mean that sometimes church attendance takes a back seat to other matters and other more important events, or so we think. Number 7, the answer they gave, they stopped attending church during the pandemic, and many just haven't gotten back around to getting back into church. Number 8, the church became too focused on money. They said too much emphasis on money and giving simply isn't healthy, and so this is problematic for church members that are treated differently due to their differences in giving. Number 9, they have social anxiety. Well, anxiety is like the big word these days, and it does affect a lot of people, and it does prevent some people from attending regularly because they just don't want to be around other people, and it gives them a high sense of anxiety, and so they don't enjoy being at church. The final reason that was given is the church focused on religion over relationship. The church should focus on building a good relationship with God and others, and not simply following rules or measuring up to an impossible standard. The rules. Too often we do make church all about the rules, don't we? The do's and the don'ts. How many rules do we impose? Hopefully not 613 like poor Nicodemus had to live with. But have we lost focus on the grace of Jesus? It's a good question for us to consider this morning. We're in our 4th week of looking at the 40 days of Jesus, our study, and where we're walking with people who encountered Jesus face to face on the way to the cross. And so the first week that we began our study, we talked about John the Baptist, and we looked at his life and how he prepared the way and he offered a new beginning. Second week was Simon Peter, and we saw how he wrestled with letting go of his expectations to trust Jesus and his strength. Last week we watched as Jesus turned over the tables in the temple, showing that rescue sometimes begins with a cleansing. Well, today we meet Nicodemus, a man with all of the credentials, all of the answers, and all of the rules, yet who still just couldn't shake the feeling that this isn't it. There's something missing. Maybe we felt that same way and looked at grace and thought to ourselves, this feels too good to be true. But as we'll see today, it really is. Because Nicodemus, first this morning had religion, but he needed a rescue. And so Nicodemus' story we find in John chapter 3. So follow along as we go on there. It says, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And so Jesus answered and said to him, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Well, Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? How can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? And Jesus answered, Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh. That which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And so do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. He says, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. Well, Nicodemus answered and said to him, How can these things be? Jesus said to him, Well, are you the teacher of Israel and do not know these things? Most assuredly, I say to you, we speak what we know and testify what we have seen, and you do not receive our witness. If I had told you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended to heaven, but he who has come down from heaven, that is the Son of Man, who is in heaven. Now it's interesting to me that John shares this story about Nicodemus right after the story of what Jesus did in the temple that we studied last week. Was Nicodemus there? Well, did he experience what Jesus did? Did he see all of what transpired? Well, we don't know. Maybe he wasn't there, but I am absolutely certain he would have heard what Jesus did. After all, he's a Pharisee. He's one of the teachers of the law. And it was such a shocking thing that happened. Everyone had to know by now what went on that day in the temple. It would have been big news around Jerusalem. And like many, Jesus' actions had to raise an eyebrow. The interest of the people would have been piqued, and certainly Nicodemus would now be paying attention a little bit to what's going on. And so Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, not because he is because he is uninterested, but because he is intrigued and wondering about this thing, maybe even afraid of what others might say if they found out he was meeting with Jesus. And so you see, Nicodemus had spent his life memorizing and interpreting 613 laws. He had devoted his life to doing everything right. He wasn't a bad man by any means. As a matter of fact, Nicodemus is a respected religious leader. He's a Pharisee. Yet when Jesus speaks of being born again, Nicodemus is confused. Look again at what he said in verse 4. He said, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born again?" Nicodemus is stuck in a system of rule keeping. But Jesus is offering something that's far greater than rules, a relationship, you see, that is not earned. But it's a relationship that is received. In his book, Something Beautiful for God, longtime British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge tells how he met Mother Teresa while filming a BBC documentary about her work. He was completely captivated by her deep compassion for the poorest of poor in the Calcutta slums, but he himself was an unbeliever, and he could not accept faith. And he especially said that he wasn't going to be going to the church because the church is such an imperfect and flawed institution. Well, one time Mother Teresa was visiting London, and she and Muggeridge took a walk, and he, excuse me, and he talks about it, and he said, "I took up my well-prepared defense position about the church, whose deficiencies, crumbling barricades, and woeful future prospects I expounded upon, but with little effect. After she left London, she wrote him a letter and enclosed a small devotional book. And here are some of the excerpts from her letter, which really are pretty powerful and could kind of teach us a few things about how we ought to share the gospel with others. But she wrote and said, "I think I understand you better now. I don't know why, but to me, you are like Nicodemus, and I'm sure the answer is the same. Unless you become like a child. I'm sure you'll understand beautifully everything if you would only become a little child in God's hands," she wrote. "Your longing for God is so deep, and yet he keeps himself away from you. He must be forcing himself to do so because he loves you so much as to give Jesus to die for you and me. Jesus is longing to be your food. Surrounded with fullness of living food, you allow yourself to starve. The personal love Jesus has for you is infinite. The small difficulty you have regarding his church is finite. Overcome the finite with the infinite. Christ has created you because he wanted you. I want you to feel terrible longing I know what you feel is terrible longing with dark emptiness, and yet he is the one in love with you." Well, apparently that kind of worked on him. Eventually, he did give his life to Jesus. just 8 short years before he died in 1990. But like Muggeridge, and Nicodemus was intellectually curious, religiously trained, morally upright, and yet something was missing. Both men were deeply entrenched in systems of belief, but starving spiritually. What Jesus told Nicodemus, Mother Teresa gently echoed to Muggeridge, unless you become like a little child. That's the invitation Jesus was offering Nicodemus that night. And it's the same invitation he offers to us. How many of us, like Nicodemus, try to earn God's love through performance? We wear our church clothes. We sit in our pews. We follow all the church rules. We just still feel distant. We're like Nicodemus. We're religious, but not rescued. You see, Jesus didn't come to polish up our religion. No. Jesus came to offer us a new heart. Because you see, second this morning, Jesus offers rescue to all who believe. It was this rescue that Nicodemus needed, a rescue from the rules of grace. And so to help Nicodemus understand, Jesus pointed to a familiar story in the Old Testament. Follow along as we pick up with verse 14 from John chapter 3. And it says, Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Jesus takes a moment here and he compassionately and gently begins to connect the dots for Nicodemus. And Jesus draws inspiration from a story that would have been very well known to Nicodemus as a teacher of the law and one who studied the Old Testament. You see, way back in Numbers chapter 21, something awful was happening. The Israelites again were complaining to Moses about being out in the desert. And so in verse 5 of Numbers 21, it says, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread. There is no water. And we detest this miserable food. Ungrateful children. Nothing but complaints. So God punished the people for their grumbling, their ingratitude, and their disobedience. God sent venomous snakes among the people. And the snakes bit the people, and the people died. According to Numbers 21. But God also gave them a cure. The cure. The only cure, you see, was to look upon a bronze snake that was atop a pole that Moses was to hold up. A symbol, by the way, that has made its way all the way down to us as the symbol of medicine and healing, right? The Israelites could not heal themselves. They had to trust in God's provision. Jesus is really saying the same thing to Nicodemus and to us today. I am the provision. I will be lifted up. Look to me and live. And then come the words that we all know, verse 16. Say it with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. But that's not the end of the story. Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues and says in verse 17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. The good news of the gospel summed up for the entire world to hear, right there. God loves you and me so much that he sent Jesus into this world to save us. And folks, that's still the good news today. It's not God helps those who help themselves. Nope. It's not try harder, do better. Nope. It's not follow every rule. Nope. Instead, Jesus says, believe in the one who was lifted up for you. That's the heart of the gospel, friends. It's not about what we do. It's about what Jesus has already done. And so finally this morning, we step into the light when we step into His grace. Can you imagine living in a dark world? Such as the story of a man and a wife named Steve and Catherine and hundreds of others. In an article online that Steve and Catherine's home is described. It sounds a lot like a dingy basement apartment, but then we notice that everything rests on crates. You see, Steve and Catherine live in an underground tunnel, flood tunnel, under Las Vegas, Nevada. But you know what? They're not alone. Amazingly, around 700 other people live in these tunnels. Day in and day out, they deal with black widow spiders and mosquitoes, but they all say it's cooler than the streets, and you know what? The cops really just don't bother them. The article profiled these flood tunnel dwellers, saying they formed a community, united by a collection of graffiti drawn by resident artists that they call their art gallery. And what else holds them together? Well, a fear of flooding, which has killed 20 of them in the last 2 decades. It's a very vivid picture in some ways of life in this world. The dark, the danger, the community evading the law. Jesus told Nicodemus these things, starting in verse 19. He said, and this is the condemnation, that the light has come to the world. And men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. See, Steve and Catherine were living below Sin City in the darkness. But they're not the only ones. Living in the darkness of sin apart from the light of Jesus, well, that's life in Sin City too. Jesus knows the pull of the darkness. He knows that light can feel exposing and uncomfortable. In verse 19, he said, men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. But there's hope, Jesus says. Verse 21, he said, he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. You see, Nicodemus came in the cover of the dark. But Jesus invited him into the light. We too are invited, not to shame, not to condemnation, but to freedom. Because in the light, you see, we find healing. In the light, we see the truth. In the light, we are reminded that rescue is not about the rules. It's about His grace. You know, this morning, Nicodemus thought Jesus was offering a way too easy path, a path that was way too easy. He had spent, you see, his entire life trying to follow the impossible 613 rules. But eventually he would believe. Nicodemus would defend Jesus in John chapter 7. Nicodemus would help bury his body in John 19. Nicodemus would step out of the shadows and into the light. Friends, you and I are invited to do the same. You know, a long time ago, back in the days of one-room schoolhouses, a story is told about a little girl named Mary. Well, Mary was super excited because it was the first day of school. Miss Tomlin, the teacher, was a new teacher, and since it was the first day, she thought it was a good idea that they ought to figure out some rules for their classroom. And so she looked at the boys and girls and said, okay, boys and girls, we need to establish some classroom rules. Does anyone have any suggestions?" And a young man raised his hand and said, "Well, how about we make it a rule that you don't cheat, you can't cheat on homework or tests?" Well, everybody agreed on that. It's a pretty good rule. Another student raised his hand and said, "You know what? You must arrive to class on time." Everybody agreed, "Hey, that's a pretty good rule too." And after a few moments of all the kids getting involved, they collectively came up with 10 rules that would be their classroom rules. Miss Tomlin asked, "Well, that's a good group of rules." And she said, "Now what do we do if one of those rules is broken?" And so they had a discussion around what to do, and a punishment was decided upon. Well, all was going well. It was now several months into the school year, and one day Miss Tomlin said, "Okay, everybody, take out your pencils and paper for a quiz." And Mary noticed that her pencil was broken. So she leaned over to her friend, "Susan, do you have a pencil I can borrow?" But before she could get a response, she heard from the front of the classroom the voice of her teacher. "Mary, I'll see you after school." Uh-oh. Mary was dreading the end of the day. Finally, the large school bell was rung, and Miss Tomlin dismissed everyone to go home. And she said, "Mary, you please come here?" Well, everybody was walking out the door on their way home. And Miss Tomlin said, "Mary, do you remember the rules we decided upon at the beginning of the school year?" And Mary nodded, and she said, "They're posted over there." Miss Tomlin asked, "Can you read rule number 4 for me, Mary?" Mary said, "If you have something to say, raise your hand." But Miss Tomlin, I didn't have," and there's no time for excuses, her teacher began. "You broke the rule. Do you remember the punishment that was decided upon?" Mary hung her head and nodded as she remembered. 3 strikes with a ruler on the back of the hand. "All right, Mary, hold out your hand." Well, she held out her hand with her eyes closed tightly, waiting for that intense pain of the ruler being flicked on her hand. And she flinched when she felt something else different touching her hand, but it wasn't a ruler. She opened her eyes and was shocked to see the hand of her older brother, Billy, who was covering her hand. And Billy spoke up and said, "Miss Tomlin, it is true that Mary broke one of the rules that the class set up. It's also true that the punishment for breaking one of those rules is 3 strikes with the ruler across the back of the hand, but it doesn't say who has to receive the punishment for breaking one of those rules. So I would like to take the punishment for her, my sister." Miss Tomlin said, "Very well, hold out your hand, Billy." Whack! 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 That's exactly what Jesus did for you and me. On the cross of Calvary, Jesus put his hand over ours. Jesus rescued us from the darkness, from our sin, from certain death. You know what? It feels pretty good. It's like being told all of your debts are paid. It's like being offered a seat at the table when you don't deserve to be there. Like being rescued when you thought all hope was lost. See, Jesus was lifted up so that we could be lifted out. It's not too good to be true. It's too good not to accept. So this morning, do you feel stuck in religion but far from God? Do you feel that tug of grace and wonder, can it really be that simple? Friends, I have great news for you. It is. Believe. Come into the light. Surrender your life to him. Be washed in the grave of baptism. Begin to walk a new life in him. Be rescued from the rules by Jesus' amazing grace.